You also have to decide when are you going to intervene in conflicts that happen on your team. Because this is something that I get asked all the time by senior leaders is everything gets escalated to me. I become the decision maker. So as a leader, how do you make clear that decisions, difficult conversations, conflicts have to be resolved at the lowest level possible? That is what's best for team culture, because it sets the precedent that those two people can actually have a difficult conversation, have a disagreement, and resolve it.
Hello, and welcome to Franklin Covey on Leadership. I'm your host, Will Hodling. Today's guest is Amy Gallo. Amy Gallo is a best-selling author and journalist whose work centers on navigating tension and conflict at work and how to build high-performing teams and organizations. She is the author of Harvard Business Review's Guide to Navigating Conflict and the author of the 2022 best-selling book, Getting Along: How to Work with Anyone, Even Difficult People. She's also the host of the award-winning Harvard Business Review podcast, Women at Work. Amy Gallo, welcome to Franklin Covey on Leadership.
Thank you so much for having me, Will.
Wonderful. Very excited for today's conversation.
Me too.
So you have spent a lot of your career focused on dealing with difficult people, with navigating conflict. So let's start on the therapy chair with talking about your mother. No, but seriously, I'd love to start a little bit more personal. What led you to this work? You've now spent a long time working on it. Is there something formative in your experience growing up or in your early professional experiences that has led you to commit and dedicate so much of your career to this topic?
Yeah, I mean, if you were my therapist, which I won't treat you like my therapist, we could go deep into there's levels of things that probably influenced early on. My parents being divorced, being raised by a single mother, who at the time I lived in a town when I was growing up where she was sort of the only single mother and the only mother who really worked. So that was a very formative for me in thinking about how we dealt with the judgment and the sort of difficult conversations we were having around that. I also, early in my career, made a few big mistakes of not telling people what I really thought in the moment and really got in trouble for it, including accidentally sending an email to a client that was not meant for her, but telling her all the things I sort of wished I could tell, but I didn't. But at the end of the day, I think really for me, it's about wanting people to be able to say what's really on their mind and not feeling like we are silenced or held back, out of a fear of conflict or damaging relationships. Because the research is clear that these difficult conversations and conflicts that we worry so much are going to hinder our ability to connect with other people, actually enhance our ability to connect with other people when we do it right.
So let's dive into dealing with conflict. You wrote the HBR guide on the topic of dealing with conflict. You gave an amazing TEDx talk on the gift of conflict. Let's start with that title. Why do you call it the gift of conflict? Most people, I think, view it like a lump of coal style gift, not a real one. So
Yes. And it's actually, I have to give credit to my friend Jeff for coming up with that title. He actually was in the audience and they come up with the title after the talk and he said, you should call it this. And he's actually a therapist. And I do think of it as a gift because it's a gift in multiple ways. Number one, anytime you are engaged in a conflict, even if you don't actually verbalize what's going on, you don't have that difficult conversation. Like if you and I will have some tension going on and I'm like, I don't know if I trust Will. I don't know if what he meant by that email. I don't know if he's trying to undermine me. It is a chance to personally reflect on what matters to me, what I feel about the situation, about trust in relationships, about collaborating with you, about the project we're working on. So for me, one of the biggest gifts of conflict, again, whether voiced or not, is the ability to learn more about myself and what matters to me and how I handle situations. I think it's an incredible way to develop all of the aspects of emotional intelligence. The other, and I alluded to this a moment ago, is that the research shows that if you and I have a fight and we're able to get to the other side, it shows that we now have a stronger relationship, because now we know, oh, there's this precedent that I can say what I mean. I can mess up, I can maybe get angry, I can shut down, and Will and I, we're still good. So we tend to therefore have a stronger relationship. So that's the other aspect of the gift. And I often tell audiences that I speak to, think of the 3 most important people in your life. Maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a kid, maybe it's a parent, maybe a friend, maybe it's a coworker. Do you never fight with those people? And almost always the answer is, of course I fight with them, right? Because we do fight with the people we love, and it's actually a sign of trust. I'm willing to risk the disruption in what we see as the normal harmony between people, because I believe in you and I believe in our relationship, and I believe in myself and my ability to get through this conversation. So I think it's a wonderful gift, but you're exactly right that most people see that, either that phrase or hear me talk about all the positive benefits of difficult conversations, and I think most of them go, oh no, like that is the opposite of a gift.
Mm-hmm. At Frank and Covey, we focus a lot on the importance of paradigms and mindsets, that true sustainable behavior change doesn't come from following a checklist of activities. It comes from viewing the world differently. And I think that the gift of conflict is a great reframing of the concept of conflict, such that we are leaning into rather than leaning away from it.
Yeah. And actually, I would just tell you quickly, because this always cracks me up, is that when I get invited to speak to an audience, and the organizers say, we love your work. Our team really needs this. We're so excited to have you in. Just one note, could you not use the word conflict? And it always cracks me. I'm like, I'm not your speaker, and you're not ready for this. So I think exactly right. That sort of paradigm shift and some people are willing to move a little bit, I know we need to talk about this, but could we maybe just use different words? And I'm like, no, that sort of defeats the entire purpose.
But it also gives you an opportunity right out the gate to be like, well, let me now model conflict for you. Exactly. I'm going to use the word conflict, and you're going to be happy about it. No, I'm sure not how you'd go with it, go through it. So, but let's actually go to that. What are the mistakes that most people make when navigating conflict?
Oh gosh. Okay. This podcast is 4 hours long, right? Because that question, there are so many mistakes, and I've made every single one.
One of the most common mistakes.
Yes. There we go. I have made every single one. Let me just say that right off the bat. Number one, and this is a very basic one, but I think it's one we make, especially when we're under stress, when we have, we sort of feel the weight of the conversation or the responsibility or the outcome on us, is that we really try to prove we are right. We show up to the conversation of I am going to convince Will with the most perfect prose that he's absolutely wrong about this, and the way I see it is perfectly right. So the ego gets involved. We get focused on being right. I think letting go of that is one of the most important things. The second is measuring the result or the success of the difficult conversation by how good it feels. So I will always tell people, you are not going to feel good about how the conversation went the moment it ends. The idea that you and I would both express our point of view, that you would hear me out, I would hear you out, and we'd walk out of the room hooked arms, being that was the best difficult conversation we ever, is just delusional. So it's gonna feel uncomfortable. It's gonna feel like the relationship is slightly damaged or maybe off base in those moments afterwards. It may be that the other person yells. It may be that you shut down. It may be that neither of you get very far in that first conversation. But that's where the opportunity is, and the gift is that you then get to come back to it, try again, learn from what went wrong in the first conversation, try to redirect. And that, I think, is the true measure, is that not what happened in the moment, but were we eventually able to get to a place that we both feel good about, even if we didn't feel good at first. So trying to prove you're right, thinking that it's going to feel good, are two of the biggest mistakes that I see.
How do you get people to continue navigating conflict, approaching difficult conversations if it doesn't feel good? And, particularly if it's not going to feel good the first time, then you're going to avoid it the second time. And then when you do it, you're going to be less practiced. And so it's this negative cycle. So how do you convince people to wade through the unpleasantness and get to the other side?
Yeah. Usually it's by focusing them on a goal, right? What do you actually want out of the conversation? And not the short-term goal of, I want to feel good coming out of this conversation, or I want to prove that I'm right. That's often our short-term goal. But what's the long-term goal? Do you need a strong relationship with this person because you're going to be collaborating for the next 5 years? Do you need to get this project done on time and under budget, right? What is it you're actually trying to achieve? And showing people that the retreating from the conflict, moving away from the difficult conversation because it didn't feel good at first, or you're convinced it's not going the way you wanted, or you're not saying the thing perfectly the way you wanted to say it, is often refocusing them and saying, okay, but to achieve the goal, you need to continue to have this conversation. And I think as humans, we are biased toward action. So we're often going to think about the consequences of action. So, I can pull out of this conversation. I can end my relationship with Will. Maybe we just have the most minimally interactive relationship. Only talk about the things we absolutely need to talk about. But that inaction is actually sometimes worse. So trying to convince people that silence is a choice, and usually it's going to lead to much more effort on your part in a week, 2 weeks, a year, when you sort of accumulate that tension and disagreement that has never been resolved. And for you personally, if you don't care about the other person at all, you're allowed to do that. But if you don't care about the other person at all, you've now silenced yourself. So I often try to get people to do the risk assessment of not only what are the risks of speaking up or re-engaging in this conversation or giving that tough feedback, but what are the risks of staying silent? And it may be that the risks of speaking up are too great and you make the choice not to. That is a fair choice and oftentimes can be the right, reasonable approach. But more often than not, what I see is that the risks of not speaking up to you personally, to the other person, to the team culture, to the organization, to the goal you're trying to achieve are actually greater than the discomfort that will come with having the conversation.
Yeah, I love that, emphasizing the long-term goal. The short-term goal of paid avoidance is not as important as the long-term goal of a better relationship or a better project or whatever the case may be. And these difficult conversations are also often an investment in the long-term success of our teams and of our relationships and of our lives.
Exactly. And if your goal really is pain avoidance, avoiding that conversation in the short term is just going to create more pain to avoid later on, right? So even that goal, I think, is not actually served by not saying anything in the moment.
Great leaders don't avoid hard conversations, they navigate them with empathy. Franklin Covey's Difficult Conversations Assessment Tool helps you build confidence and improve communication to lead with authenticity and understanding. Grab your free copy from the show notes and discover how to turn tension into progress. In this category, we are in the leadership business as well. There is a lot of similar source material, kind of foundational source material out there. We all stand on the shoulders of giants as we develop our ideas. There has been a lot of great work on navigating conflict, on dealing with difficult people over the course of the last 10, 20 years. A couple that stand out in particular that I'm curious for your feedback on, Amy Edmondson. What from Amy Edmondson's work do you take? What inspires you? What inspires some of your own work and thinking? And then what do you feel like she misses or that you're kind of adding to the canon there?
Yeah. I mean, Amy's work is amazing and is very foundational to what I do. Any conversation about difficult conversations it has to have a consideration of psychological safety. And more when I'm asked to help organizations and teams navigate conflicts better, have a speak up culture, I'm often bringing in this element of Amy's work around psychological safety and particularly around risk. I mean, what Amy's last book did around failure is really talk about what risks are worth taking as a team. How do you set up a team to experiment where failure is allowed, right? Where you have that psychological safety, but you learn from the failures. And it's just, I find her research, the way she frames things, the way she's willing to update her thinking through more research, just to be integral to what I do and sort of really refreshing, honestly, in a lot of the academic world. One of the updates she did that I really appreciated is that her definition of psychological safety used to say that people would feel free to give feedback, speak up, push back, deliver bad news without fear of negative consequences. And which was to me, that makes total sense. But what she updated it to is that we are willing to speak up, push back, admit mistakes, not because of fear, without fear of negative consequences, but because we know it's welcomed and valued. And that's such an important distinction, because it's rather, the instruction then for leaders is not don't punish people if they speak up, but actually lay out the red carpet for them to speak up, because that's how you get, going back to your question around how do you get people to do this even though it's uncomfortable, not punishing them is table stakes. Laying out the red carpet, showing them what they gain, explaining how you'll use their input, what you'll do when they admit mistakes, explaining how that will enhance what you do as a team, that is a totally different story, right? That is how you sort of elevate and make it really understandable to leaders how to achieve what they're trying to achieve. One of the things that I think Amy, that I really try to bring in my book, Getting Along, and Amy does this. I'm in no way am I saying she doesn't, but it's really also trying to consider the issue of identity and how different identity factors, whether it's gender, race, faith, ability, how that influences our ability to have these difficult conversations, how we are received when we're aggressive versus warm, how we're received when we push back on someone who's more senior than us versus a peer, and trying to sort of integrate that sense of identity into the work and how that interplays with psychological safety.
So you've given kind of two pieces of practical advice so far on navigating conflict. First, approach, don't avoid conflict. The second, create, building on what Amy Edmondson has done, talking about the value and importance of creating psychological safety in your relationships, in your teams. What are two other practical pieces of advice you would give to leaders, managers, individual contributors on how to effectively navigate conflict?
Yeah. Well, for leaders in particular, as I said, you sort of have to roll out that red carpet, right? Really make it clear what you're going to do with the input that they give. You also have to decide when are you going to intervene in conflicts that happen on your team. Because this is something that I get asked all the time by senior leaders is everything gets escalated to me. I become the decision maker. So as a leader, how do you make clear that decisions, difficult conversations, conflicts have to be resolved at the lowest level possible? That is what's best for team culture, because it sets the precedent that those two people can actually have a difficult conversation, have a disagreement, and resolve it. And so one of the things I really encourage leaders to do is said, instead of becoming the decision maker, as soon as someone comes to you and says, we can't decide this, immediately turn that into a coaching opportunity, right? And ask the person questions. What do you know about their perspective, right? Get them to do that role playing, that perspective taking. What do you know about what they care about? What's your goal? What's actually at stake here? What is the underlying the discussion? What's the business decision that has to be made? Okay, now let's talk through the pros and cons of different approaches. I could make the decision, and here's what would happen if I did that. But here's what would happen if you went and had that difficult conversation, or here's what might happen if you brought the team together to talk this through and facilitate a discussion. So trying to switch from a problem-solving, decision-making viewpoint to a coaching perspective so that you are enhancing the ability for the people on the team to actually solve those disagreements and conflicts themselves.
I think that's such an important mindset shift of you are the problem solver in chief to you are the enabler or the empowerer. I'm really glad you brought that up, and that's something we echo a lot in our work as well. So I want to move now to the book that you referenced, Getting Along: How to Deal with Anyone, Even Difficult People. In the book, you talk about there are 8 different archetypes of difficult people. I'm not going to quiz you and ask you to rattle off the 8 archetypes.
I can actually do it now, but yes. But
asking Will Hunting to name his 8 siblings in Good Will Hunting, or whatever it was, 9 siblings. But why don't we choose the 3 most damaging, insidious, painful, difficult people, and if you could just kind of describe those 3 archetypes and why they're so difficult to deal with at work.
Yeah, my view on which are the most difficult changes, depending on who I'm dealing with at the moment. But I will say, without question, one of the most difficult is someone who I call the tormentor, and that's someone who you expect to be a mentor.
They sound difficult, so that should be the top of the list.
Exactly. It's sort of an obvious choice. But yes, it's someone you expect to be a mentor, probably more senior than you, came up before you. Maybe you share something in common, went to the same school. Maybe you're both only women in a male-dominated field, but you expect this person to look after you, and instead they constantly undermine you. They question your commitment to work. They assign you needless tasks. They disparage you, maybe in front of you or to others. This was the chapter for the book where the people I interviewed were more likely to quit than the other chapters. It was much harder to get that relationship back on track. The second one I would say is the passive-aggressive peer. This was the sort of the impetus for writing this book. It's the question I can clock every time I do a Q&A. The first, second, or third question will be, how do I deal with passive-aggressive behavior? So this is someone who says one thing but behaves another way, commits to doing something and never follows up, displays body language that makes them seem like they're so angry, upset, something, and you ask them how they're doing, and they say fine, right? Classic passive behavior, passive-aggressive behavior. And the third, I would say, I'm debating, but I'm going to go with insecure manager or insecure boss. That's and I think that's one of the hardest, because it is someone who's more senior than you, and this is someone who micromanages, doesn't trust you, maybe hoards information, tries to cut you off from other parts of the organization because they're afraid your success will undermine them in some way. And it's incredibly difficult to deal with, in part because it's the exact opposite from what we want from a boss, even though it's actually quite common. And the remedy is often something I just don't love to do, which is you need to, in some ways, flatter them and actually show them you trust them, lessen their sort of ego defensiveness. And so that I would add as a third. I could do all 8 real quick because I think they're all difficult, but those are the top 3.
Let's talk about, you said your most common Q&A is, how do I deal with a passive-aggressive peer? So let's dive into that one. How do you deal with a passive-aggressive peer?
Yeah. Well, number one, you don't tell them they're passive-aggressive because no one goes to work and comes home at the end of the day and says, God, I was so passive-aggressive today. No one thinks, they might think they're petty. They might think, it's not safe here to say what I think. If you're in a leadership position, this is where I come back to Amy Edmondson's brilliant work, which is that you have to lay out the carpet, the red carpet, make clear you are absolutely open to disagreement. Part of what inspires passive-aggressive behavior is this feeling like it's not safe to be direct and honest about what I think and feel. Now, that might come from them, but if you haven't made very clear that it's okay to be direct and honest, even when your opinion or perspective is contrary to the rest of the team or to you as the leader, then you are going to inadvertently encourage that passive-aggressive behavior. One of the other things that you can do is when we deal with someone who's being passive-aggressive, we often want to sort of call them out on the hypocrisy. Like, you said you were okay, but then you did this. Or you say you're fine, but you're like sat frowning through this whole meeting with your arms crossed. And that's not helpful because oftentimes, as I mentioned earlier, they're not even aware of what they're doing. Or they might be well aware, but have no interest in changing it. So what you want to do is get to the underlying message. Like, what are they actually trying to convey? And you can do something which the social psychologist Heidi Grant, who's at Columbia, and when I interviewed her for the book, she suggested she calls hypothesis testing. So if you say one thing, Will, but I have a sense you feel differently, I might say, Will, your body language is telling me that perhaps you're not happy with this strategy. Could you tell me more about why that might be? Right? And you might go, nope, I'm fine with it. No, I told you I'm fine with it. But you've actually then put the person on notice that you're going to pay attention, not just to what they say, but what they mean underneath the surface. With repeated incidents like that, where you actually note what they might truly mean, they might start to feel seen. So you might actually get a little bit more honesty. Or they might go, oh God, Amy always calls me out on this. Maybe I'll just be honest this time, right? I can't guarantee any of these tactics will work, but they're all worth experimenting with to see what might work with your particular colleague.
In the book, you also talk, thank you for that very specific advice on dealing with passive aggressive. You also in the book talk about 9 broad principles for getting along that work across the different archetypes. Maybe is there one or two of those principles that you think are highest impact or easiest for people to adopt and implement that kind of our listeners can take away today to start getting along better at work tomorrow?
Yeah. So I just mentioned one, and I think it actually connects to several of the things we've touched on today, which is to experiment to find what works. I think your question earlier, which is such a great question around how do you actually get people to stick with this when it's hard, when conflict avoidance seems like such an easier path. One of the things I see is that when someone is dealing with someone that they found challenging, they try one thing and then they're like, didn't work. Oh my gosh, what a failure. This relationship is beyond the pale, right? Like they can't imagine trying to do something else. But you have to put on that sort of curious scientist mindset of this is an experiment. What might work? Right. And it's a bit of a Jedi mind trick because you're everything in your body and mind will be telling you, stop interacting with this person. They're pain. This is not helpful. Avoid. So you have to really just sort of go, this is fun. And this is fun because I will learn something, even if I learn that this tactic doesn't work. So it's try one tactic, learn, reflect on what worked, what didn't, try another tactic, reflect on what learned. And if you get to 10 tactics that didn't work, okay, maybe you need a different approach entirely, but you have to try multiple to see. And it may be that one tactic works when you're in a group, but not one-on-one or vice versa. Or one tactic works when we're just after a project that went really well versus not working when a project just was a failure. So you have to try them in different environments and see it as an opportunity to learn. That's where that gift comes back in. So that's one, experiment to find what works. The other is, and this is, I think, something people are familiar with. Actually, I'll share 2 others quickly, but which is that your perspective is just one perspective. And I think it's really important to remind yourself of this constantly, right? There's this social psychologist concept called naive realism, which is that if I look at something and I see it a certain way and you come along and you're like, oh, that's different, and you see it a different way, I think, oh gosh, he needs to get his eyes checked. He clearly is wrong, right? Instead of thinking, oh, there's 2 different ways to see this. And that's really how we have to think of difficult conversations and sort of relationships at work that aren't easy, which is there are 2 ways to approach this. You might think that behavior is absolutely unprofessional, inappropriate. That person might think that behavior is absolutely fine. And you have to, not that you have to change your values or your morals, but it can be helpful to acknowledge there's a different way of seeing this. And that often loosens our grip on the outcome or the process we're going to use to resolve the issue with the other person. The other one I do want to mention quickly is just not seeing it as you versus the other person. It's very easy if you and I are in a conflict or in a situation where we're not getting along to think, oh, this is me versus Will. And what instead, the image I really try to bring up is that it's me and Will versus the problem we're having. And that problem might be the way we interact over email. It might be the way we behave passive aggressively toward one another. But seeing it as something you're solving together puts you in less of a combative mode and more of a collaborative one, which, if your goal is to improve this relationship, is the much better mindset to be in.
I love that final piece of advice. Very similar in 7 Habits. Habit 4, think win-win, of the importance of abundance mindset versus zero-sum scarcity mindset. And it's not us versus them. There's a third alternative.
Yeah.
So I think I love hearing that. I'm also really happy you brought up the idea of naive realism. And the kind of acclaimed psychologist Esther Perel often talks about couples therapy, that in couples therapy, most of the time, one of the partners will come to her and say, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be in couples therapy because my partner has all these problems and mistakes, and so I'm just going to drop them off and then I'll leave. When I come back, you will fix them. And she says, we always think it's the other person's fault. And in fact, it takes 2 to tango in every conflict. So I often think that in a lot of this interpersonal work, self-awareness is the miracle drug, and that if we all can identify our own identity threats and where we are dealing with perceived risk and lack of safety and how that influences our behavior in conflict, the conflict will go a lot better.
Yeah. How
do you encourage individuals and teams to become more self-aware?
Yeah, this is the challenge, because I think it's the people who are least self-aware don't know that, right? Like that's sort of and I remember actually working with an emotional intelligence expert named Annie McKee, who was a longtime collaborator with Daniel Goleman. And I remember she had been asked to develop this sort of quiz on how emotionally intelligent are you. And she said it's impossible for someone with low emotional intelligence to actually, they're going to act as if they're completely emotionally intelligent. It's unfortunately something that's pretty easy to fake. So the one of the things I think as a leader is to develop the self-awareness of the team, which there's one tactic I've seen work really well in teams, is actually sort of tasking everyone with writing a user guide to yourself. So a user guide to Amy, you've probably seen this in practice, where people talk, and it can be everything from I'm vegetarian, please keep that in mind when we're doing team dinners, to I was on the debate team in high school, therefore I say things very directly and often aggressively. It's a style thing. I don't mean to to undermine you or dismiss you, right? It can be anything that people feel like others should know about them. Oftentimes, I will ask the most self-aware person on the team to do it first as a model, because I think sometimes if you don't have that level of self-awareness or emotional intelligence, it's hard to even know what to say. So that's one tactic I've seen really work. The other is, as a leader, and this goes to something you were asking earlier about sort of tips for leaders and managers. I think when you're in a conflict, when things are starting to get tense, I've seen this work in practice, and you don't have to be the most senior person in the room to do this. I was actually on a call about a month ago where the most junior person on the call did it, which is that things started to get tense. We were debating how to close this project. We had very different views on how quickly and who needed to be involved in the sort of sunsetting, and things started to get tense. And the most junior person on the call said, "This is really hard. I'm really glad we're having this conversation." Right? So it was this moment where we all probably felt the tension, and maybe our instinct was like, how do we smooth things over? Because often in those moments, we all look to the senior most person. How are they responding? How should I respond? But instead, she sort of raised the self-awareness of the group of like, oh, right, this feels bad. It feels bad for a reason. And it's good we're having this conversation. So even small statements like that, I think, can really help develop the self-awareness of the group. And that is going to be much easier than trying to, pinpoint someone who has very low emotional intelligence and say, you need a little bit more self-awareness, right?
Well, it sounds like a very impressive junior person on the team. So great to have that person involved in the conversation.
Indeed, yeah.
As we go to close, I want to move to a quick lightning round before we ask our traditional wrap-up question. I think I read recently online that you dropped your daughter off at college. Is that right?
That's right. She's been there, I guess, 2 months now. Yeah.
What advice do you have for her entering the workforce in this age of AI? I think it's a rule actually that with modern podcasts, if you don't say the word AI while recording, they don't allow you to publish the episode. So thank you very much to the powers that be at Spotify and Apple. I've fulfilled that requirement. But in all seriousness, what advice do you have for your daughter on entering the workforce in this age?
Again, we have 4 more hours, right? Because I have so much.
Yeah.
I think the primary thing when I think about my work is AI is designed to reduce friction, right? The way it sort of interacts with you, the way it pulls information is trying to make things smooth. But human interaction, development of emotional intelligence, the development of trust between people, has to be messy. If we really want good, strong relationships with others, and we want to do good work, we can't get rid of the friction. And we have to watch for the ways that AI will do that over and over and make sure that we're introducing in our non-AI interactions that friction and that sort of vitality so that we're able to build trust and enhance our relationships. The second thing I will just say is that I heard, not at her college, but another college, a professor's first assignment was, here's a prompt for an essay, use AI to write it, and then you will be graded on when you come to my office hours and talk me through why the essay worked or didn't work when AI wrote it. So my advice to my daughter is be critical about what it produces. Talk to people, professors, experts about what you've created from it, because you're going to use it, I know that, and whether it really holds water, where it's getting it right, where it's getting it wrong.
I love that advice. In the age of AI, we are editors, not creators, and our human judgment is the thing that will separate and differentiate us.
That's right.
So second question, you are an amazing podcast host yourself. I felt nervous going into today's conversation. It's like asking Tiger Woods to play a round of golf. So with your Women at Work HBR podcast, which won many awards over the years. And so congratulations on an incredible run there.
Thank you.
What is the podcast that you listen to for work and for fun?
Okay.
And maybe it's the same one, but we'll go for 2.
Okay, I'm going to go for fun first. There's an amazing podcast called The Handsome Podcast. It's 3 comedians, Tig Notaro, Fortune Feimster, and Mae Martin. It's the only podcast I listen to the moment it drops. It makes me laugh out loud. It's my company around when I'm walking the dog around the block. For work, I listen a lot to Hidden Brain, so because I'm very much into how does the science impact how we behave every day, and I think that podcast does such a beautiful job of it. It's also fun because I get to hear a lot of the experts who I interview for my work actually be on a podcast as well, and hear academics really talking about what's the sort of impact of their work on people's everyday lives.
Awesome. Great. Well, I've heard of Hidden Brain. I've not heard of the first one, so you give me a good recommendation to go with. Final question. If you had a billboard that millions of people drove past and you could put something up on that billboard for everybody to think about on their morning or evening commute, what would you write on the billboard?
Probably conflict is let me just say it this way. Conflict can be a force for good. So just trying to reframe, shift that paradigm around our complete aversion to conflict, which, to be fair, if you look at everything from the Real Housewives empire to U.S. politics to global geopolitics, like, of course we think conflict is terrible. But I think in our interpersonal reactions, we should be leaning into it more. So I truly believe it can be a force for good. I'd like to change those millions of drivers' minds as they're driving to work.
Awesome. Maybe a million drivers calling their mother-in-laws to resolve whatever unresolved tensions they have. Perfect.
That's beyond my purview, but yes, that
maybe that's the subtitle in the lower corner. Have you called your mother-in-law today? No, but I love my mother-in-law. That's a broad joke, not a personal one.
Likewise.
All right. So our traditional closing question: Frank is a leadership company. Who is a leader that has greatly influenced the way you view the world, and what can we all take from them?
Oh, this is so hard because there's just so many amazing leaders. I will say, and I think this was, I will say Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, who just had an incredible run as a working mother, as someone who really stood for compassion and her ability to really relate to the people she was leading in a genuine way, and then to do the compassionate thing, even in a world of politics, which sort of almost always encourages you not to, and then to do all of that while being very transparent that she was pregnant and had a baby and was a mother. She's someone I look to in terms of, and then also making the choice to step down when she chose to step down. And she's someone I just admire quite a bit.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the time today, Amy, and thank you for all the insights about how to navigate conflict more effectively, how to build high-performing, engaged, connected teams, how to deal with difficult people. It's been a really informative, helpful, and enjoyable episode. So thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you. This has been really fun.
Absolutely. And to all of our listeners, I hope you enjoyed and got as much out of today's conversation as I did. I hope you pick somebody in your life that you've maybe been avoiding conflict, and today is the day you approach it. I have somebody in my mind. And thank you so much for listening, and hope you join us next week for another episode of Frank and Covey on Leadership.